past, and try to understand the issue and recognize where we should stand on the issues. The lesson that we talked about last week primarily was just the history of the division. I don't know if you can see that or not, it's kind of small, but we talked about the missionary society, and we talked about colleges in the church budget. And this week, we're going to try to talk about the orphan home question. So, I wasn't alive when these things happened. I didn't come along until well after these things happened. So what will be the value? Well, as we said, there's value in learning history so that we know what happened, so we know not to repeat things that happened that weren't so good, and so that we're prepared to deal with issues as they come about in the future. If you're asked the question, what caused the division within the churches of Christ in the 50s and 60s, probably you're going to think about the orphan home question. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to try to talk about that and try to make some sense of it this morning. And so let's just jump right in. I'm going to try to go quickly. So just a quick recap. In the 1800s, mid-1800s, there was a split over missionary society and instrumental music. The result of that was the formation of the Christian church, and even more liberal, those groups were the disciples of Christ. So you're driving along, you see a Christian church. Where did that come from? Well, that was a result of the division in the churches of Christ in the mid-1800s. In the mid-1900s, these were the issues, and these were the results. There was split, division, mainly those years, 1955 to 1965. And the result that you have, we're going to talk a little bit about today, is more institutional and non-institutional churches of Christ. We use those terms to label them. So, let's talk about the orphan home question today. The orphan home, as we said, was the most noted of all the differences. So that's what we remember when we think about the split between the churches. It carried the most emotion, obviously, because there were children that needed care, and that's what the whole issue was about. And so it had a lot of emotion to it. You know, colleges in the church budget, that wasn't really an emotional issue. That's just about we can do some good. But this was more of an emotional issue, and I think it was the most misunderstood of the issues. And so hopefully we can try to make some sense of it today. But I do think it was some of the most misunderstood of the issues causing the split. All right, let's look at the history behind it. You know, there was orphan homes that were around long before the division. So we said the division happened between the 1950s to 1960s, but there was orphan homes around before that. It wasn't like an orphan home was just started in 1950, and then by 1952 there was division. The Tennessee Orphan Home, just right up the road here, started in 1909. The Potter Orphan Home, 1914. Bowles Home, 1924. Southern Christian Home in 26. And then Tipton, Oklahoma had an orphan home in 1928. And so they were around some years before the division happened. There was opposition in the 30s and 40s. So when somebody brought up the issue, hey, I think we should put orphan homes in the church budget, there was opposition. It was slow to catch on. Just like colleges in the budget. Sound Brethren fought against it, as they did in 1849 and following. Remember we said the Missionary Society, when it was introduced, there was people against it. And then eventually they sort of changed their mind and then they bought into it. If you study this issue at all, as I was looking over details to talk about, Guy N. Wood's name came up very often. So if you're familiar with this issue, Guy N. Woods is a name that you'll come across. It's interesting, Guy N. Woods opposed such institutions like we're talking about initially. Let's look at a quote from Guy N. Woods. This was at the Abilene Christian College lectures in 1939. This is interesting. Remember last week we talked about G.C. Brewer? At the same college lectures in 1938, remember G.C. Brewer said, if you don't have colleges in the church budget, you got the wrong preacher. Remember we said that? Well, the very next year, Guy N. Woods was there, and he said the ship of Zion has floundered more than once on the sandbar of institutionalism. The tendency to organize is a characteristic of the age. On the theory that the end justifies the means, brethren have now scrupled to form organizations in the church to do the work the church itself was designed to do. All such organizations usurp the work of the church and are unnecessary and sinful. I think that's a pretty good statement. I agree. I couldn't have said it better. In 1946, he said there's no place for charitable organizations in the work of the New Testament church. It is the only charitable organization that the Lord authorizes or that is needed to do the work the Lord expects His people to do. He said that in the annual lesson commentary. That's from the Gospel Advocate in 1946. So, Guy and Woods opposed such things, but what we're going to see is that he ended up endorsing them. And a bunch of the debates that happened, Guy and Woods argued in favor of orphan home question, which is interesting. Sort of like Alexander Campbell did with the Missionary Society. He initially opposed it, then he was for it. Same thing with Guy and Woods. We mentioned last week that N.B. Hardeman shifted the issue in 1947. So the first thing that was brought up was colleges to be supported by the church, and the issue sort of was shifted to the orphan homes being supported. And we read this quote last week that the principle that permits one permits another, they must stand or fall together. And we said that we agreed, we think they fall together. But that was the first issue in colleges, and then it was shifted to the orphan home issue. Now there was many debates. I've got a small sampling of debates here. This is by no means exhaustive. There's a whole lot of debates that happened. Let me see, I think that's all I got. So, all across the country. Now, Woods is Guy and Woods, and now he's debating for it. So he met Roy E. Cogdo and debated for orphan homes, churches supporting them. A.C. Greiger and Guy and Woods debated. Carol Sutton and Guy and Woods debated. Just a whole lot of debates about the issue. Even some of you here, I know you remember debates and meetings and discussions happening about it. And so this is just a small sampling. The point I want to make is that this was a big deal. There was much discussion that went into this thing. This wasn't just some idea and it was here today and gone tomorrow. This was a big deal. And so the members of the churches of Christ in this time would turn out in huge crowds to hear what these men would have to say about the issue. Let's go see what Guy and Woods and Roy E. Cogdo have to say about this issue, and it was a big deal. So there was a big controversy, a lot of debates happening. I wish, on a side note, I wish that people had the sort of interest today that they did then. I mean, I don't want trouble, that's not what I'm saying, I don't want division. But if we could get enough interest about spiritual things to get a group of people together, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? Now, this was troublesome. But there was a lot of people getting together because they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to know the truth on the issue. All right, there was journals that was published on both sides of the issue. So there was journals that favored orphan homes. Now remember, we talked last week about the Gospel Advocate. Remember why we said the Gospel Advocate was started? It was started to oppose institutions. It was started to oppose missionary societies. Well, now it favored orphan homes. Firm Foundation, 20th Century Christian Chronicle. Under B.C. Goodpasture's leadership, the Gospel Advocate had now sort of changed their tune. Now there's two different types. So let me go back a minute. So these two men and these two different journals, they both were in favor of churches supporting orphan homes. But they disagreed on how they should support the orphan home. For instance, one of them thought that it should be under an eldership. So we should get an eldership, so let's say here at Atlanta, if there was 5 elders, we should set up an orphan home under the 5 elders here, and they oversee what happens there. And the other thought that it should be under a board, such as those orphan homes, like the Tennessee orphan home. So there's a board set up, and it's kind of separate from an eldership of local congregation. You just may have Christians from multiple churches forming a board. And so they agreed that churches should support orphan homes. They disagreed on how that should happen. That's the point I'm trying to make there. There was also journals that opposed such things. The Gospel Guardian, Truth Magazine, Searching the Scriptures, The Preceptor, and these men associated with it, Roy E. Cogdo and Gator Tent, are some pretty familiar names. Things started getting bitter, though. I read that people would call the Gospel Guardian the Gospel Garbage because they didn't like it. If you're against opposing, or if you're against orphan homes, you oppose it. Well, Roy E. Cogdo's over there at the Gospel Garbage. That's what he's writing about. And so things got intense. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But as we said, the church is divided in the mid-50s to the mid-60s. Historians estimate an 80-20 split. What that means is 80% of the churches went in favor of institutions and 20% did not. So 80-20 is a pretty big difference, right? If you got a group of 100 people and 80 go for something and 20 are left, that's a smaller group. So this sort of leads us to where we're at today. There are some big non-institutional churches. I'm not saying they're not, but the majority of churches that aren't are smaller. They're smaller groups because the majority of people left and went with the institutional persuasion. Usually a small group would pull off and start a new work. That just makes sense. That didn't happen everywhere, but if you got a big group and 80% are for something and there's only 20% against it, then usually the smaller percentage are going to go and start a new work. There are some exceptions. In Louisville and Athens, Alabama, Tampa, and Birmingham, Alabama, the majority of churches did not go and support institutionalism. The majority of them opposed such things. And so those were sort of the exceptions. But basically everywhere else, it was an 80-20 split. All right. As we said, things got ugly and bitter. There was a thing called a yellow tag of quarantine. So B.C. Goodpasture of the Gospel Advocate, he was the editor there. In 1954, he came up with this thing called the yellow tag of quarantine. And the idea was that those brethren that opposed institutions need to be left alone. They're infested antis, and we don't want to have anything to do with them. And so they would boycott stores such as like the CEI bookstore. You know, we buy materials from them. Well, the people that run the CEI bookstore, they're opposed to institutions, so we'll boycott them. We'll leave them alone. That's pretty interesting, the yellow tag of quarantine. Robert Jackson. I think a lot of people know Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson went to a meeting at Taylor Boulevard in Louisville, Kentucky. He was invited to go there. Of the elders, the majority of the elders there were in favor of institutionalism. There was at least one that wasn't. Well, after the service was over, one of these men that were in favor of institutionalism invited Robert to come downstairs into the basement. He went downstairs into the basement. They cut off the lights, and one of the other elders said, "Robert, they got a knife." They tried to stab him because he opposed institutionalism. You know, at that very same meeting, it's interesting. There was hardwood floors in the building, and women would wear heels. And it said that they would sit in the back and clap their heels on the floor to try to drown out his preaching. You know, because he was standing against such things that we were for. Also at that same meeting, this just blows my mind, but while he was preaching, presenting his lesson, men would take turns walking from the back to the front, and they would come up front and say, "You need to go back to Nashville. You go back home. You know, we don't want to hear you here." And so things were very ugly and very bitter. Rufus Clifford was spat upon for his stance of these things. Billy Ashworth, I think many people know Billy Ashworth here. He was preaching over in Marshall County at Berea. There was a group of men that got together, and they were going to go beat him up. They were going to whip him after he got out of the church building if they got a chance to get him alone. So things were really, really intense here. There were ads for preacher openings, and they would say, "No ante need apply." Now ante, I don't know if any of us have ever, I haven't ever been called an anti, but what that means, you're anti means opposed to or against something. So you're anti-orphan home, or you're anti-institution. And so if you're going to apply for a preaching job, no anti need apply. We don't want you here. There was charges made, such as, you are orphan haters. And they would say things maybe like, you would let an orphan child starve on the steps of the church building before you would take money out of the church's treasury in order to help them. Those were false charges. In fact, what you see is, and what we're even, people who are members here today know that there were brethren that were wanting to help, and they did help, and they took in and themselves adopted children to care for them. And so it's a false charge. It's one made by emotion and not really the fact of the issue. But these were some of the things being thrown around. You're orphan haters. Some people were locked out of buildings where they were members. So if the majority of people there agreed with these things and a small percentage didn't, they would lock the doors. And you'd show up to go to services one day and you couldn't get in. They'd change the locks. You know, we don't want you here. You're not going to get on board with us. And so I've sort of got the more conservative side stories that I know about and have heard about, but things got ugly and bitter on both sides. And I'd be wrong if I said that everybody on the non-institutional side conducted themselves the way they ought to. I can't say that. Things got really ugly, really bitter. You think you have a hard time coming to services sometime? Oh, just think about when this stuff is going on. It's bad deal. So things were really ugly, things were really bitter. And these are just some examples of the people that I know about that had issues. So that's the history behind it. Let's talk about the issue. I hope we spent some time going over the history behind it. I hope that sort of sets us up for how the emotion and how the issues were involved in what's going on. Let's talk about the issue. The issue is not, should the needy be cared for? The issue was and is not, is the church obligated? The issue is not a matter of how, modes, means, methods. The issue is not a systematic arrangement, and the issue is not a matter of a place being maintained. That's not the issue. The issue is, can churches build and maintain benevolent organizations through which to do their work? And the issue is, it's a matter of a separate organization doing the work of the church. That is the issue. All right. Let's look at the problems with the support of orphan homes. The first thing I want to say is there's no authority for that. Now, if you were here last week, we talked about Acts chapter 15. We're not going to go through that in great detail again. But in Acts 15, the question at hand was, can Gentiles be saved? Can a Gentile be saved as a Gentile, or do they need to be converted to a Jew, be circumcised in order to be saved? That was the question at hand. And so there was 3 speeches made in Acts chapter 15. James appealed in his speech to a direct statement from Amos chapter 9. And James just said, Gentiles that are called by my name. God said that. He appealed to a direct statement from God. Paul and Barnabas appealed to an example of their work and miracles. So Paul and Barnabas went out on the first missionary journey. They performed miracles. And so they showed God approved of what we're doing because we're able to perform miracles. And then Peter appealed to the events at Cornelius' house. Remember, Cornelius was the first Gentile convert. And the Holy Spirit fell upon Cornelius and his household. And so what Peter said was that I'm inferring that because the Holy Spirit fell on the Gentiles, that tells me that they can be saved. And so that's how authority is established. That's a really long study. We can look at a lot of things, but Acts 15 is good because it's all there in one place. So the problem with the orphan home question is there's no authority for that. And so when you go to the Bible to look for a command or a statement, well, there isn't one. Is there an example? There's none. Is there a necessary inference? It's not there. And so that's the big issue with it, and there's no authority for it. It's parallel to the missionary society. We spent a lot of time last week talking about the missionary society, where local churches would send money to this organization, and that organization would decide what preachers to support. And there's a separate organization between the church and the work. The orphan home of the benevolent society is the same thing. You have a local church sending money to this organization, and then that organization would decide what need to be cared for. And so it's a separate organization between the church and the work needing to be done. It's not the fact that work needed to be done or that churches have a responsibility to do the work. It's just the issue is how it's to be done. And having a separate institution between the two, you just don't find that in the Bible. That's the issue. And so it's a false charge to say, we don't care for anybody that's needy. That's not the case. We're just saying, instead of having that in the middle, why don't this local church care for the needy? Because that's the pattern that you have there in the Bible. A church can do its own work. In Acts chapter 6, Jared read for us there. If you want to turn to Acts chapter 6, we want to look at a case where the church cared for people that were in need. They took care of their own. And let's talk about that just a minute. In Acts chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, it says, in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them and said, it is not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look out among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer, to the ministry of the word. And then, I'm sorry, Jared, I make you read all those names, but they picked all those names of people out. So they picked out 7 men, and verse 6 says, they set them before the apostles. When they prayed, they laid their hands on them. And so there were 7 men picked out to take care of the needy saints within that church at Jerusalem. So the facts are that there was widows that were being neglected. There was widows neglected. There was a needy person there. In verse 3, the congregation selected 7 men. The apostles appointed them. They put them up in front of the apostles. The apostles appointed them to that work. The 7 men were over the business of caring for the widows. So that was one of their roles. Now, they were still Christians. They still had other responsibilities. But one of their roles was to make sure that those widows got the daily food that they needed. And so you've got a case of a church taking care of its own. What happened was, as we said, the local church took care of its own need. What they didn't do was set up another organization. They didn't say, all right, we're going to take these 7 men, and we're going to take Stephen, we're going to make him the president. We're going to take Philip, we're going to make him the vice president. We're going to set up these other men as the secretary, treasurer, and board of directors. We'll donate money to them, and then they'll decide who needs to be cared for. They didn't do that. It was just the church took care of their own need. And so that's what we're saying. When there's a need, it's not that we ignore it. We don't care if there's somebody in need. It's just we handle it in the right way. Now, the church can relieve some people, as we've been saying. But let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. I think this is really important, a couple of verses. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 16. I think this is important, one verse to read. 1 Timothy 5:16. It says, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So, 1 Timothy 5:16 says, you got a man or a woman, they've got a widow in their family. It said, let them relieve that widow and their family, and let not the church be charged, so that the church can relieve those that are widows indeed. A widow indeed would be a widow that has no family to care for. She can't care for herself. She's got no family to take care of. So there's an individual responsibility to care for your family members that may be widows. The church has a responsibility to care for those that are widows indeed. And so the church can care for its own. And there's a way for an individual to do that and a way for churches to do that. You see that? All right. Let's talk about limited benevolence. And we'll go through this real quick. Limited benevolence. This wasn't the main issue, it was a secondary issue, but it was an issue. And so the question is, who can the church help? In other words, can the church take money out of its treasury and give to anybody and everybody, or is it just for the needy saints? Well, these are the only 9 passages that I know of in the New Testament that talk about church benevolence. There's others that talk about individuals giving and helping. But these are the only ones that I know of about the church helping people. And every one of these mention that it's for a needy saint. So it may call them brethren or a child of God. It may call them a believer. Romans 15, right off the top of my head, says that they went to go help the needy saints. And so who can the church help? Well, everywhere in the New Testament it's talking about the needy saints. So does that mean that there's a person that's not a Christian, we can't help them? We just let them? No. That means that now I as an individual have to step up to the plate and help out where I can. But the church is supposed to help those that are needy saints. And so that's a secondary issue, but that was an issue at the time. Who can the church help? They can help the needy saints. All right, there's some arguments made to justify the orphan home or a benevolent society. And the first argument, probably the most common, would be James 1 and verse 27. So we're going to turn over there and read James 1:27. James 1 and verse 27 says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. So James 1:27 says that we're to visit the fatherless. Maybe a newer version may say visit an orphan. The thing about James 1 is that it addresses the individual. Look at the context. If you're looking at James chapter 1, verse 23 says, if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is likened to a man beholding his natural face in a glass. Verse 24 says, he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and forgetteth what manner of man he was. Verse 25 says, whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, he, being a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. If any man among you, in verse 26, and so then you get to verse 27, James is talking to individuals the whole way through, and you get to verse 27, and then he says, pure and undefiled religion for God the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. So, at the end of it, he says, keep himself unspotted from the world. So James 1:27 is talking to the individual. Now, when this split was happening, I read that there was churches that would put James 1:27 on their sign out front. We believe in James 1:27. I don't know of any church that said they didn't. I think the issue is it talking to a church or is it talking to an individual? And I believe it's talking to an individual. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that James 1:27 is talking about the church and what they're supposed to do. I don't believe it is, but let's just say that it is. Even if it is, there's no organization between the church and the orphan being cared for. There's no organization set up there. So even if it was talking about the church, there's no organization. All right, notice the shifting that took place. So we started out talking about the individual, and then we shifted to the church, and then we shifted that to the benevolent society. And so this whole thing takes all the burden off an individual, and I don't think the Bible does that. We have individual responsibilities to care for those that we have an opportunity to care for. Another argument to justify this is Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Let's look at, well actually I think I've got it up here on the screen, yeah. So this passage again addresses the individual, not the church. So Galatians 6 and verse 10, of course, says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. All right, I highlighted in red where it's talking to an individual all down through here. So verse 4, let every man prove his own work, he shall have rejoicing. Let every man bear his own burden. Let him who is taught be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. So you go all the way down through here, and it's talking to individuals. So on the judgment day, whatever I sow, I'm gonna reap that. I'm gonna be rewarded for what I've done. The Lantern, you guys are gonna say, "Oh, you're part of Lantern. Lantern's good." No, we're going to stand individually before God. Here, we're talking to individuals, and then we get down here. So individuals all the way through, and then we get down here. As we have therefore opportunity, let us individually do good to all men, especially to them who are of the household of faith. I think it's Paul's talking to individuals. All right, the few verses after it, notice verse 12. He says they constrain you to be circumcised. So if all of Galatians 6 is talking to the church, does a church get circumcised or is it an individual? Well, it's an individual. The whole passage is talking about an individual thing. So in Galatians 6, he's talking to an individual. And in the middle of that, he says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men. So that was used to justify the orphan home question. As we have opportunity, let us do good to all men. But that's talking to the individual. It's not talking about the church. But let's just say that it is. Even if it was, it doesn't put an organization in between the church and the work that needs to be done. Even if it was talking about church. Hopefully you see that. There's another argument that was made, and that was of the Good Samaritan. In Luke chapter 10, I just want to read one verse from Luke chapter 10. In verse 35, we know the story of the Good Samaritan. And in Luke 10 and verse 35, remember the Samaritan took care of the man that was wounded and beaten, and he was really left for dead. And the Good Samaritan took him to an inn, and he paid for the care that needed to be done there. Notice it says in Luke 10:35, on the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host and said unto him, take care of him. Whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. The Good Samaritan is a really good story. The argument that's made is that the Good Samaritan gave money to an organization that in turn cared for this man. And that's the argument that's made. Well, the thing about that is, again, the passage addresses an individual. The Good Samaritan is a person. The Good Samaritan is not a church acting. He's not even acting on behalf of a church. In fact, the point of the Good Samaritan is he wasn't even a child of God. That's the whole point of the story. There was people who were supposed to be Levites, passing them. They were supposed to be children of God. They were supposed to be godly people. they left the man for dead. The Good Samaritan, who hated the Jews, they had issues with each other, he took care of him. That's part of the story. So the Good Samaritan isn't even a child of God, but it's addressing an individual, not a church. He bought a service. So in verse 35, that's what he did. He bought a service. He didn't contribute to an organization and let that organization decide who the money's going to go to. He paid them to care for him. He bought a service. So the Good Samaritan didn't, as we said, give to an organization, and then that innkeeper, or the organization decided what innkeeper to give the money to. No, the Good Samaritan bought a service. Hopefully we see that. Now there is a difference. We're going to take a minute to talk about this. There's a difference between buying a service and contributing to something. Now you notice we got the same thing, same list. But there's a difference between going to a radio station and say, we want to buy a 30-minute block of time, and in that 30-minute block of time, we're going to record a lesson or whatever, and we're going to put that out, broadcast that to the world. There's a difference between that and then going to the radio station and say, we're going to give you $1,000 a month, and you just, if you want to play things religious, you decide what you want to do and put it out there. We're going to contribute to your work. You see that difference? Same thing with all of these. We take out an ad in the newspaper, say, we invite you to come to the Latin Church of Christ. Or if we give money to the newspaper, let them decide what they want to publish. There's a difference. And all of those. Hopefully you see that. So we can buy a service. So couldn't we do that today? Let's say there's a member here whose house burned. Couldn't we take money out of the treasury and go and pay for a hotel room for them to put them up? Well, of course we could. We could buy a service. Of course we could. What we wouldn't be able to do is give money to some organization and let them decide who they're going to care for. We would take care of our own. And so there's a difference there. An argument, now this argument was made to me actually in college. I had a really good friend in college, and he is a member of an institutional Church of Christ. Really good guy, and we're really good friends to this day. But he argued with me when we discussed this that a church can do what an individual can do. So anything that you can do individually, he would say a church can do. And that's just not right. So I go buy a new truck. Did the church just buy a new truck? No, I did. The church didn't. You know, if I go eat dinner somewhere, did the church eat? No. So individually I can do some things, and the church can do some things that I can't do. It's not one and the same. And we spent time talking about 1 Timothy 5:16. Now we already read that verse. But that verse shows us that there's a difference between an individual and a church. So, an individual, it says, if any man or woman, that's an individual, they have, that believeth have widows, let them relieve them. So an individual should relieve them if they're in their own family. It says, and let not the church be charged, that the church may relieve them that are widows in need. So there's a difference. The Bible even separates them out. Individuals are to care for their family members that are widows, and the church ought to care for those that are widows in need. There's a difference. There's a lot of other places that we can look at for that, but there's a difference between them. What about how an individual and a church is able to accrue money? Well, individually, we may get a job, we may work, we may buy and sell things in order to get money, but the church gets its money by a contribution that we take out. And so there's a difference. So hopefully that makes sense. But there's a difference between the individual and the church. And so what their argument would be is that, well, since an individual can give to an organization, the church can give to an organization because they're one and the same. And that's just not so. All right, we're almost done here. So that was arguments made to justify the orphan home question. All right. I know that's a whole lot to take in. We're just throwing out a lot of information. But hopefully that's been an encouragement to you to know what the issue was. And obviously we just tried to rush through to get the issues out there. So hopefully that wasn't a big discouragement. But there was a lot of trouble. There was a lot of trouble in the 50s and 60s that went through with the churches. And there was division. Things were really, really ugly and bitter. We need to know what the issues were because I'm afraid that something's going to come up again and we're not going to know how to deal with it. You know, this coronavirus pandemic really caught us all off guard. And we weren't prepared for that. We didn't know how to deal with that. I never would have ever thought that we'd have to consider just canceling services or having a drive-in service. That's crazy. We had never thought about that even in December of last year, January of this year. Well, we got to be prepared for issues like this. I know this is different, but we've got to be prepared when issues arise. How are we going to answer them? Because when we get caught off guard, then maybe we start going with emotional arguments and we just get the I'm right, you're wrong attitude, and we're not just sitting down and looking at the issue. So I think there's value in talking about these things. We'll try to continue these lessons. We've got 2 more that we want to talk about, and hopefully they'll continue to be an encouragement to you. If you got questions or you want to talk to me about it, I certainly don't have all the answers. As I said, I wasn't even alive when these things happen, so I'm just looking back and trying to talk to people and read on things that happen, and then look at the issue just from the Bible. Hopefully that's been good for you. All right, so we've been talking to us about things that haven't really encouraged us to become a Christian, but you need to become a Christian. Have you done that? If you haven't, please consider that. If you'd like to study Plan of Salvation more, if you'd like to be baptized in Christ, we'd be glad to do that, help you out with that today. Have you been a Christian, but you've fallen away, like you haven't been holding up your obligation to the Lord, if you need to come back to Him, we pray that you would do that while we stand and while we sing this song.